She texted me a photo of champagne. First class lounge, Rome. Her caption read, "Finally choosing joy. Number 45, the anniversary number, we deserve this." Meanwhile, I was in a plastic chair beside my son's hospital bed. The beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound I could hear. Liam's fingers twitched as he slept thin pale with an IV taped to his arm. I hadn't slept in 2 days. I had just come back from selling my car. I was still short by $30,000. So I called her. My mother. She picked up on the third ring, her voice light distant. "Julia. Can it wait? We're about to board." "No, Mom," I said. My voice cracked. "Liam needs surgery. There's a mass near his spine. We've sold everything. I just need help, anything you can do." A pause, then a sigh. "You know we just spent a fortune on this trip. Your father's been planning it for years." She lowered her voice. "Don't make us feel guilty when we're finally doing something for ourselves." I stared at the wall. The cracks in the paint. The chart with Liam's vitals. My hands shook. "It's your grandson," I whispered. "He's 10. You should have planned better," she snapped. "It's your child, not ours." And just like that, she hung up. I sat in silence, unable to cry. It wasn't the rejection that broke me. It was the final confirmation I had never truly belonged to them. Not when they picked my brother's failed business over my college tuition. Not when they skipped my divorce hearing for a golf retreat. And not now when my son might not survive. They were never my safety net. Only a glass ceiling I kept bumping my head against. I looked at Liam. His lashes trembled. His tiny voice broke through the room. "Mom, are you still there?" I reached out and held his hand. "I'm here, baby. I'm not going anywhere." That night, as machines beeped and the hallway lights flickered outside our room, I realized something. They chose luxury. I would choose love. And from that moment on, I knew exactly what kind of family I needed to build. Not one defined by blood, but by who showed up when everything else fell apart. Would you ask again, or walk away forever? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever turned their back when you needed them most? Our mornings always started the same. Toast. 1 egg. A tiny splash of almond milk in my coffee. Liam sitting at the table sketching on napkins with a red crayon. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment off Fair Oaks Boulevard. The walls were thin, the heating was unreliable, but it was ours. My bedroom doubled as an office with a $99 desk from Target and a secondhand printer that jammed every Monday morning. Every inch of our home held a trace of me. Sticky notes with grocery reminders, laundry piled in a green basket, and a small corkboard by the fridge where Liam pinned his latest art commissions. He once taped up a drawing labeled "Supermom Saves the Day." I cried quietly that night. At school, I was the quiet one in the front office. Never late. Never loud. Always the first to volunteer when someone needed a shift covered. I wore the same navy cardigans and sensible flats because the budget didn't leave room for fun money. But I kept Liam's favorite lunch packed every day: grilled cheese, apple slices, and a note with a joke. We didn't have much, but we had rhythm, predictability, love. I had never expected my parents to suddenly soften, but I had hoped deep down that being a mother might redeem me in their eyes. Instead, they sent birthday cards signed with only their names. No grandma or grandpa, just Tom and Margaret. My brother Brent had 3 kids, 2 boats, and 0 self-control. He called our parents his investors. They bailed him out of 2 failed startups and a DUI settlement. They gave him a $40,000 check when his youngest chipped a tooth. Emergency orthodontics, they called it. When Liam broke his wrist during a playground fall, I paid for the cast in installments, while they posted photos from Tuscany. Still, I never spoke up. I was raised not to make waves. Not to air family business. I tried to reconnect. I invited them to Liam's first school play. They said it was the same weekend as their garden club retreat. At Thanksgiving, they hosted dinner in Santa Barbara. Long table. Name cards. China plates. Brent made a toast about gratitude. I passed mashed potatoes while Liam sat beside me, ignored by his cousins. Afterward, I overheard my mother tell a guest. Julia always had a hard time keeping up. She's simple. I smiled politely, then drove 6 hours back to Sacramento in silence, Liam asleep in the back seat, still holding the pinecone centerpiece he had picked up from their table. The resentment was quiet, like a splinter you forget about until it throbs. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. I was sorting envelopes at my desk when the school nurse called. Liam collapsed during recess, she said. He's conscious, but something's not right. My fingers went cold. I dropped everything and ran. At the ER, Liam clung to my hand. I feel weird, Mommy, he whispered. I can't feel my legs. His scans showed a mass. Not cancer, they said. Not yet. But dangerously close to critical nerves. The surgeon's words blurred in my ears. Operable. Urgent. Costly. I didn't ask how much, not until we were taken to the billing office. $117, $300 total. I nodded. Left the room. Vomited in the hallway. That night, I opened my laptop and made a spreadsheet. Sold the car. Paused every subscription. Applied for emergency aid. Set up a GoFundMe even though asking for help made my stomach twist. Within 48 hours, we had raised $12,000. Friends from high school shared the post. A stranger in Portland sent $20 with a note for Liam. From one single mom to another. But the gap remained. $30,000 we didn't have. And the clock was ticking. I waited until the day before their flight. My parents. Off to Europe for their 45th anniversary. They had just posted a photo matching suitcases beside their Lexus. Number. Deserved number. Grateful. I stared at it, then called. And that's where chapter 1 begins. Where the door finally closed. Where I stopped trying to earn love that was never truly offered. The morning after the call, I sat on the floor beside Liam's bed. My back against the cold wall. My hands clutching a calculator. It didn't matter how many times I rechecked the numbers, the gap never changed. $31,200. I opened my laptop and stared at the GoFundMe again. $1,200 from old classmates. $200 from a retired teacher at Liam's school. $10 from a woman I didn't know in Wisconsin. But the large donations, they never came, especially not from family. I texted my parents again. Just one line, please. Even alone. They left it on read. And a few hours later posted a video sipping wine in Florence. That night I began listing everything I owned. My laptop. Our living room couch. Liam's tablet. Even my grandmother's quilt I had saved since childhood. I posted it all to Craigslist. Wrote descriptions in between nurse check-ins. Answered messages while feeding Liam apple slices and pudding. A woman named Teresa came to view the sofa. She asked, "You moving?" I smiled. Number just. Making space. She looked at Liam's drawings on the wall, the half-empty bottle of hand sanitizer on the table, and said nothing. But when she paid, she added $200 above the asking price. For the kid, she whispered. The hardest part was pawning my wedding ring. Not because it was valuable, it wasn't, but because it was the last thing that made me feel like I'd had a normal life once. A time when hope lived in a one-bedroom apartment with takeout dinners and Liam in a high chair. The pawnshop clerk didn't ask questions. He weighed it. Tapped on a calculator, $315. Take it or leave it. I took it. I emailed my bank for a personal loan. Rejected within minutes. Your income doesn't meet our collateral requirements. I contacted a charity for single parents. Waitlist. I called Brent. My brother. I hadn't spoken to him in a year. He answered like nothing had changed. Hey Jules, you finally joined the group chat again. I swallowed hard. Liam's in the hospital. We need to raise money for his surgery. A pause, then laughter. Wait, you're asking me. You know I'm in between ventures. I heard glasses clinking in the background. A party. Of course. Just thought you'd want to know, I said quietly. He didn't reply. Didn't even ask how Liam was doing. The call ended with static. I hadn't been on the family group chat in months. So, I opened it. The last message was a selfie of my parents in a gondola. The caption living our best life. Don't wait to be happy. A few heart emojis from Brent. Nothing else. I scrolled back further. No one had acknowledged the GoFundMe link I'd posted days ago. It had been buried under photos of cheese plates and matching scarves. Liam slept most of the day now. The meds made him drowsy, his body tired from fighting. He still smiled when awake. Still asked for silly stories. Still drew pictures with shaky hands. He once handed me a crumpled napkin with the words, "Mom, we're strong." I taped it above my desk at the hospital. 2 days later, a knock came on the door. Miss Gutierrez, the school janitor. She brought a casserole dish and an envelope. I heard. It's not much, but inside $87 in small bills. Cash she probably didn't have to spare. I cried. Right there in the hallway. Not because of the money, but because someone finally showed up. Not family, not blood. Just someone who understood what kindness meant. Word spread. A local artist offered to sell prints and donate the profit. Liam's teacher organized a bake sale. A bus driver dropped off groceries. We reached $82,000. Still not enough. Still short. Still counting. But I started to feel something I hadn't felt in weeks. Held. Seen. Not alone. Then one afternoon I found an envelope slid under the hospital door. No name. No note. Just cash. $400. And a single line scribbled on the flap. Family isn't who you're born to. It's who shows up. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling tiles, thinking of all the birthdays I'd spent trying to please my parents. All the Sundays I drove Liam down to Santa Barbara hoping they'd care. The pictures Liam had drawn for them never displayed. The questions he asked after every visit. Why don't they hug me like they hug cousin Max? I never had an answer. But I knew now I didn't owe them one. They had their chance. They made their choice, and I was done begging to be chosen. The nurse came in at 5:47 a.m. just as the hallway lights flickered on. She adjusted Liam's fore and whispered, "He's stable for now, but we can't wait much longer." I nodded. My mouth was too dry to speak. I hadn't slept again. There was a new tightness in Liam's jaw when he breathed. His skin looked almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights. Every beep of the monitor sounded louder. More urgent. I stepped out into the hallway, leaning against the wall. I called them. One last time. They were back from Europe now. I knew because Brent had posted a family brunch photo. Everyone smiling. Lobster eggs Benedict. Mimosas. I called Mom first. She didn't pick up. I called Dad. He answered on the third ring. Julia. His voice was clipped. Like he was taking a business call. I just need 10 minutes, I said. This isn't about guilt. I'm asking for help just this once. He was quiet for a second, then cleared his throat. I thought we were clear. You made your choices. We made ours. My stomach twisted. Dad. This is Liam. He sighed. You've always been so emotional, Julia. We raised you to be stronger than this. Stronger. That word hit differently now. It didn't feel like encouragement. It felt like dismissal. A cold rejection wrapped in faux wisdom. I hung up. No tears this time, just silence. A quiet surrender. The next day, a nurse told me there had been a delay with the OR schedule. Someone had pushed back our time, a patient whose surgery had been prepaid. Unless you can secure full payment by Friday, she trailed off. Her face was kind, but her words sliced through me. Time had become a currency I couldn't afford, and we were running out. That evening Brent texted. Brent, hey, just heard about the GoFundMe. That's not really a good look for the family, you know. Might want to keep things more private. I stared at the message for a full minute. Then I wrote back, "Me, did you donate?" No response, just silence. I thought about the last time Brent and I spoke face to face. Liam's 5th birthday. We'd hosted a small party at McKinley Park, juice, boxes, hot dogs, balloons tied to folding chairs. Brent arrived late wearing sunglasses and a leather jacket, brought a giant box wrapped in designer paper. It was a toy. Liam didn't know how to use something expensive and loud. He stayed for 20 minutes, took photos for Instagram, then left without saying goodbye. That night, Liam asked Uncle Brent left already. He had drawn a thank you card with his wobbly handwriting. It stayed in my purse for weeks. I never had the courage to send it. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been edited to make space for people who never truly showed up. Photos retaken to crop out hurt. Conversations tiptoed to avoid conflict. Praises swallowed so others could shine. All that effort to protect their image. All that silence to preserve their comfort. I went into the hospital chapel that night. It was empty. Dim light filtered through colored glass. The air smelled faintly of dust and candle wax. I sat in the back row and stared at the ceiling. "I've done everything I can," I whispered. To be good, to be enough. To be worthy. My voice cracked. I can't keep bleeding for people who don't even notice I'm cut. When I returned to the room, Liam was awake. He looked at me with those wide, honest eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "do people stop loving you if you make mistakes?" I sat beside him, held his small, fragile hand, pressed it against my heart. "No, baby," I whispered. "Real love doesn't do that." He closed his eyes again. And in that moment, I let go. Of waiting, of hoping, of asking. My family had made their choice. Now it was time I made mine. The next morning, I withdrew the last $2,000 from my account. It was meant for rent, utilities, groceries. I handed it to the hospital billing office and said, "Use this to hold our spot, I'll get the rest." Then I stepped outside into the crisp morning air and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Matt's parents. Liam's grandparents on the other side. Carol answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, but cautious. "Julia, is everything all right?" I hadn't spoken to Matt's parents in nearly 2 years. Not since the divorce. We hadn't ended in anger, just exhaustion, but they had always loved Liam. Never missed a birthday, never treated him like an obligation. I took a breath. "No, not really," I said. And then the words came rushing out. The tumor, the surgery, the money. The silence from my own parents. When I finished, I expected hesitation. Or polite sympathy. Instead, I heard Carol sniffle. Then Henry's voice in the background. "Tell her we'll be there tomorrow." They arrived the next day, 2 paper bags filled with groceries, a bouquet of sunflowers for Liam. Carol hugged me in the hallway. Her arms were small but steady. "I'm sorry, we didn't know," she whispered. Henry stood at the foot of Liam's bed. He gently touched the boy's shoulder. "We're not rich, but we'll help however we can." And somehow that meant more than any blank check ever could. Later that night, I found a message on the GoFundMe. Anonymous. $5,000. The comment read, "For the boy who deserves better than silence." It wasn't from Brent. Or my parents. I knew that in my bones. It was someone who saw the gap and decided to bridge it. That weekend, I got a knock at my apartment door. It was Travis, a former student intern from years ago. He handed me an envelope. "I know this is weird. I just saw your post. Inside $320. All in 10s and 20s. He blushed. I was gonna buy a new laptop. But this felt more important. I couldn't speak. I just hugged him. People I hadn't spoken to in a decade reached out. A teacher from Liam's preschool sent $200. A neighbor slipped a bag of groceries on our porch. An old friend from college messaged, "I just wish your family had acted like one." Each gift chipped away at the hopelessness. Each message stitched something back inside me. We were still short, still racing the clock. But now we weren't racing alone. Liam's strength began to fade faster. He stopped drawing, stopped eating. Even his smile began to disappear. One night as I sat beside him, he looked at me and asked, "Mom, am I going to die?" I couldn't lie. I couldn't cry. I just held him, pressing his head to my chest, and whispered, "Not if I can help it." The next day, Henry pulled me aside. "We want to talk to you and Matt," he said. Matt and I hadn't spoken much since the divorce. We had grown apart not from anger but from the weight of everything unspoken. But we met that night in the hospital cafeteria. The fluorescent lights buzzing above the vending machines humming behind us. Henry laid out a folder. Inside, property papers. "We're selling the house," he said simply. Carol reached across and took my hand. "We can rent. But Liam only gets one chance." I stared at them, shocked, silent. "This isn't charity," Carol said. "This is family." The house they had lived in for 30 years, the one where Liam had taken his first steps, where Carol had taught him to bake cinnamon rolls, they were giving it up. For him, for us. That night, I sat in my car gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe. Not because I was broken, but because something in me had been rebuilt. We submitted the full payment to the hospital 3 days later. They scheduled the surgery. Liam squeezed my hand before they wheeled him away. His voice barely a whisper. "You didn't give up." "No," I said. "I never will." The surgery took 6 hours. But it felt like a lifetime. I sat in the waiting room with a beaded bracelet in my hand. Liam had made it for me at school. It spelled out "Best Mom Ever" in uneven plastic letters. Carol sat beside me, quietly knitting. Henry paced near the window, arms crossed tight. Matt showed up halfway through the 3rd hour. We didn't speak at first. He just handed me a coffee and sat down. His silence wasn't cold, just heavy. "I should have done more," he said eventually. "I should have been here sooner." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because forgiveness was still a wound, not yet a scar. The surgeon came out near dusk. Face unreadable, gloves still on. He gave a small nod. "It went well. He's stable." The mass was pressing on a nerve cluster, but we removed it in time. My legs buckled. Matt caught me before I fell. Carol cried. Liam was going to live. Recovery was slow, painful. Liam couldn't move his right hand. The doctors said it might come back with therapy. Or it might not. He didn't complain, just looked at his fingers and whispered, "They're asleep, Mom." I smiled, kissed his forehead, and said, "We'll wake them up together." On the 3rd day after surgery, I stepped outside for air. My phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I let it ring once. Twice, then picked up. Julia, it was my mother. Her voice was soft. Almost practiced. "I just wanted to check how things are." I closed my eyes. "He made it through," I said. "Thanks to everyone who wasn't you." A pause. "That's unfair," she said quickly. "You know how much pressure your father was under." The store, the image, the timing. I laughed. A quiet, bitter sound. "Timing," I repeated. "Yeah, you chose a wine tasting over a child's life. Your own grandchild." She exhaled. "I called, didn't I?" "You called now," I said. "After the articles started circulating, after the whispers began in your social circle." Silence. I continued. "People see things. They connect dots. They ask questions." "Julia," she said, "don't make this worse than it already is." "I'm not making anything," I replied. "I'm just done pretending." Then I hung up. And for the first time in years, I felt clean. 2 weeks later, I was invited to speak on a local podcast about community support and resilience. I said yes. They asked about Liam's story. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. I simply said, sometimes the people you expect to save you walk away. And sometimes strangers build the bridge instead. The clip went viral. Thousands of shares. Messages from mothers, from daughters, from women who had once been left behind too. A reporter called. Then another. Articles started appearing. Titles like "Single Mom Raises $120K to Save Son After Family Refuses to Help." Love without blood, the community that stepped in. The story traveled. And with it, so did the shame. I got a call from Brent. I didn't pick up. He texted instead. You couldn't just let it go, could you? Let it go. As if what happened to Liam was just a scratch. A detail, an inconvenience. I didn't reply. Some things don't deserve answers. One evening, I checked the GoFundMe page. There were still comments coming in. From Ohio, from Alaska, from women with different names, but the same story my family left me too. I needed to hear this. I thought I was alone. I wrote back to every one of them. Late at night, after Liam had fallen asleep, when the apartment was quiet and still. It felt like healing. Small, slow, but real. Matt came by more often. He brought groceries. Fixed the leaky faucet. Read Liam bedtime stories. We never talked about us. Not yet. There were still too many bruises. Too many things unsaid. But when I saw him watching Liam draw with his left hand, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Not guilt. Not regret, just love. Real, unearned, unconditional. Sometimes I still thought about my parents. I imagined them reading the articles, seeing the photos, hearing the whispers. I imagined the silence at their dinner table, the empty chairs at brunch, the way people slowly stop answering their calls. But I didn't feel vindicated. Not exactly. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the story, rewriting what family meant, and finally understanding that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Have you ever had to choose peace over pride? If this story resonates with you, share your moment of quiet strength below. You are not alone. Someone else needs your story too. The invitation came on a Wednesday afternoon. Subject line: Voices of Resilience, guest feature request. At first, I thought it was spam, but when I opened the email, I recognized the name. A national podcast. A show that shared stories of ordinary people surviving the impossible. They had seen the article. They wanted me to tell my story, on their next episode. I stared at the message for a long time. Liam was asleep on the couch, his left hand still gripping a pencil. He had started drawing again. I thought about everything that had happened. The silence, the rejections, the strangers, who became family. The people who held me up when those bound to me by blood disappeared. And I realized something: I didn't need to expose anyone. The truth would do it for me. The studio flew me to New York. It was my first time on a plane in over a decade. I wore a navy blouse I had borrowed from Carol. Simple. Clean. Just enough for me to feel steady. The host was kind. Older, sharp-eyed. She didn't rush. After some warm-up questions, she leaned in and asked, "If you could say one thing to the people who abandoned you when your son needed them most, what would it be?" I paused, breathed in, looked at the camera. "Thank you," I said. "Because you taught me that I never needed to keep chasing love that came with conditions. And because of your absence, I discovered what real family looks like." I didn't mention names, but I knew they'd recognize every detail. The episode aired 3 days later. It exploded. Clips circulated on Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. People stitched their own stories into mine. Thousands of comments. Messages from strangers. Women who had walked out of rooms where they were never heard. Mothers who raised children alone while being called selfish. Daughters who chose boundaries over tradition. I read them all. Each one felt like a brick in something stronger. Something solid. The fallout came quietly. Not from me, but from the world around them. A boutique furniture line canceled its partnership with my parents' store. One by one, their vendors backed out. Friends stopped returning calls. A former family friend emailed me. Said she had seen the episode. Said she'd always wondered why my parents never talked about Liam. "It all makes sense now," she wrote. "I'm sorry I never asked." Brent tried to defend them online. Posted a long paragraph about family being complicated and not judging without context. But the comments weren't kind. People remembered. The engagement party. The $330,000 ring he had bragged about on LinkedIn. Natalie, his fiancée, quietly deleted all their photos, changed her relationship status, and moved back in with her mother. I didn't gloat, didn't laugh, but I felt that shift. That quiet rebalancing of the scales. One afternoon I got a call from the school district. They had seen the interview. They wanted to feature Liam's story in their monthly newsletter. Your strength, they said, is a model for our whole community. I didn't know what to say, so I just said thank you. That night I sat with Liam as he colored. He looked up at me and said, "People keep saying you're brave." I smiled. "I'm just your mom. That's what makes you brave," he said. I excused myself and went to the kitchen so he wouldn't see me cry. After that, I made a decision. If people could give me their last $10 without knowing me, if Carol and Henry could sell their home, if Travis could give up a laptop to help a little boy, then I had to do something more. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Something that had no name but felt like gratitude and legacy and justice all braided into one. I started with Anna, my old friend from college. The one who had sent $500 from her monthly savings. I invited her to coffee. She still wore the same patchwork coat. Still drove her old red Corolla. When she arrived, I handed her a thick envelope. She blinked. "Julia, what is this? You once told me your dream was to open a small music school." I smiled. "I think it's time," she cried. "Right there in the cafe." And so did I. Next was Travis. He had stayed in touch. Still worked part-time while finishing community college. I offered him a full scholarship to a design institute in Chicago, the one he thought was out of reach. His eyes filled with disbelief. "Are you serious?" "As serious as Liam's second chance," I said. Finally, I turned to Carol and Henry. They had never asked for anything. Never hinted. Never made me feel indebted. But I remembered the boxes they packed, the home they left. I contacted a realtor, found out the house had gone up for sale again from the couple who had bought it as a flip. It took time, negotiations, but eventually it was ours again. I waited until Carol's birthday. We had cake in our backyard. Liam handed her a card with a shaky heart drawn in the center. After dinner, I gave her a small box. Inside, the original house key and a copy of the new deed. Her hands trembled. Henry didn't speak, just gripped my arm tightly. I simply said, "It's time you come home." We weren't rich, but we were whole. Liam had his own room again. Carol baked on weekends. Henry helped with homework. And I woke up each morning to the sound of my son laughing in a kitchen filled with love. The letter came in an envelope without a return address. Thick cream paper. Shaky handwriting. It was from my mother. I sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light slanting across the tile. Carol's banana bread cooling on the counter. Liam napping upstairs with his arm around a stuffed bear. I didn't want to open it, but I did. "Julia, we have lost everything. The store is gone. Your father is sick. Brent moved to Nevada. Our friends won't speak to us. I am not writing to blame you. I am writing because I don't know what else to do. Your father signed a mortgage to keep the store alive. Now the bank is taking the house. We need help. Just enough to stay afloat. Please." No apology. Just desperation. I read it twice. Then a third time. My fingers gripped the edge of the paper, but I didn't tear it. I folded it neatly and slipped it into a drawer beside Liam's first drawing of our new home. 2 days later, she called. Her voice cracked before she even said my name. "We don't have anywhere to go," she said. "I'm not asking for pity, just help." I asked her how much they needed. She hesitated, then said $200,000. I almost laughed. Not from amusement, from the surreal math of it all. They couldn't give me $10,000 to save Liam. But now they wanted $200 to save their image, their pride, Their roof. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked to meet in person. At my office. I'll give you the funds, I said. But there's a condition. She agreed. Desperate always says yes. They arrived on a Friday morning. The third-floor conference room was filled with winter sunlight. The walls were white, the carpet silent. On the table sat a single black suitcase. Inside, 200,000 in neatly stacked bills. My father looked older than I remembered. His eyes dull, hands trembling. My mother's coat was no longer designer, her heels scuffed. Her hair dull and streaked with gray. They sat. I did not. I'm giving this, I said, because I don't believe anyone deserves to be on the street. Not even people who abandoned me. My mother started to cry, reached for the suitcase. I held up my hand. One more thing, I said. When you leave this room, we are no longer family. They froze. I will not take another call. Not another letter. No visits, no favors, no future. My voice didn't shake. Not once. This money is not forgiveness. It's closure. My mother sobbed. My father stared at the floor. I pressed the suitcase toward them, then stood. Please escort our guests out, I told my assistant. They walked past me without a word. I didn't turn around. I didn't watch the elevator doors close. I just stood there. Hands steady. Heart quiet. That night I told Matt and Carol what happened. We sat by the fireplace, Liam drawing spaceships at our feet. Matt just nodded. You did the right thing, he said. You're stronger than all of them. I didn't feel strong. Not exactly. But I felt free. After that, they never contacted me again. No calls, no messages. I didn't feel relief or sorrow, just stillness. Like finally stepping off a boat that had been rocking for too long. Months passed. Spring came. Liam returned to school. His hand hadn't fully recovered, but he learned to adapt. He drew with his left. Played soccer with the other kids. Sometimes he still woke up from nightmares. But when he opened his eyes, he saw me. He saw Carol. He saw home. One afternoon, he came home holding a school flyer. It was for a writing contest, My Greatest Hero. He handed it to me and said, I already know who I'm writing about. I smiled, didn't ask. Didn't need to. That same week, my company was named one of the top 30 most influential design firms in Northern California. The magazine used a photo of me standing on a rooftop with a blueprint in one hand and sunlight behind me. The headline read, Building Backwards to Move Forward, Julia Sanders on Love, Legacy, and Letting Go. I framed the article and placed it in the office hallway. Not to show off, but to remember. Because every inch of success I had came from the same place that nearly broke me. Not revenge, not hate, but clarity. People still ask me, how did you forgive them? And I say I didn't. I just stopped letting their choices define me. Justice doesn't always look like courtrooms or confessions. Sometimes it's a quiet moment where you finally close the door without slamming it. Where you walk away not to hurt them, but to protect what you've built. What you've become. The house sits on the edge of Sacramento where the traffic slows and the sky feels wider. Not a mansion. Not some dream on a magazine page. But it's mine, ours. Each room holds a second chance. Each light switch, each cupboard, each scuff on the wooden floor, they're small testaments to a life rebuilt, not handed down. Liam calls it our forever house. He painted the mailbox himself last summer. The letters are crooked, the paint's already chipping. But I won't fix it. I want to remember this season, the season we stopped surviving and started living. Every morning I hear the same sound, his feet hitting the floor, then thudding down the stairs in mismatched socks. Carol's already in the kitchen by then, the smell of cinnamon drifting down the hallway. Henry hums off key as he feeds the birds. Matt pours coffee steady now. Some mornings I pause in the hallway, one hand on the doorframe, just listening. To the sounds of a life I once thought I'd lost. Or maybe never had. Not the noise of drama. Not the clink of champagne flutes at a party that excluded us. But the quiet thrum of something real. Something that stayed. We threw a small picnic in our backyard last month. Nothing extravagant. Just people who had shown up when it counted. Anna brought homemade cookies, her laugh as big as ever. Travis came with his design portfolio. He's interning at a firm in Chicago now. Carol made lemonade. Henry grilled. Liam played tag with the neighbors' kids. At sunset, he climbed onto a plastic chair and tapped his fork against a mason jar. "I want to say something," he said. His voice cracked halfway through. "I wouldn't be here without all of you. And my mom." He looked at me. Eyes steady. Older than 10. She never gave up. Even when people we thought loved us didn't. No one clapped at first. They were too stunned. Then the wave came. Applause. Tears. Hugs. I held his hand and whispered, "You didn't give up either." I used to think legacy was about what you left behind. Buildings. Bank accounts. Names etched into plaques. But now I know better. Legacy is what you live. What you give away without expecting it back. What your child says when he thinks no one is listening. It's the soft tap of Liam's hand on my shoulder at bedtime. It's Carol's old recipes now written in Liam's notebook. It's Henry showing him how to sand wood on Saturday mornings. It's the silence after a wound that no longer stings. Not because it didn't matter, but because I've chosen not to let it define me anymore. The letter from my mother still sits in a drawer in my office. I've never burned it. Never framed it. It's just there. Paper and ink. I don't look at it often. But I keep it. Not for nostalgia, not for pain. For perspective. For the woman I used to be, waiting for approval that never came. Begging even when I had nothing left to trade. I see her now with gentleness. She did her best. But she was starving for something that was never going to be offered freely. Some people still ask, "But have you forgiven them?" And I smile. Because I know what they mean. They want the clean ending. The bow-tied conclusion. But life doesn't hand out neat finales. I didn't forgive them because they never truly asked. Not with depth. Not with remorse. What I did was something else. I stopped carrying it. Stopped rehearsing old arguments in my head. Stopped hoping they'd wake up and realize I mattered. And somehow that was more powerful than any apology they could have fumbled their way through. Every Friday, I pick Liam up from school. He asks the same question every time: pancakes or Carol's soup tonight. The answer is always both if you do your reading. He rolls his eyes, then grins like he always does. His scar still visible near his collarbone, but he doesn't hide it anymore. He told a new classmate it was his hero line. Said it's how he knows he made it through something big. I couldn't have said it better myself. A few weeks ago, I was asked to speak at a conference for women in leadership. I almost said no, but Carol told me, "You've lived it. That makes you more than qualified." So I said yes. I stood in a room of 200 women, some younger, some older. All of them holding their own invisible letters in their pockets. I told them what I had learned. That closure is something you claim, not something you're handed. That legacy can grow from failure. That love doesn't require permission or blood. That sometimes justice looks like peace. Like protecting your child and choosing yourself. After the talk, one woman came up to me. She looked tired, but strong in a way I recognized. She said, "I just left my mother's house for the last time last week. She told me I'd regret it, but now I think I'll be okay." She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The connection was enough. The shared silence between two people who had once stood at the edge of the same cliff. Liam recently wrote an essay for school. Title: "The Day My Mom Became My Hero." He read it aloud during parent night. Carol cried. Matt had to leave the room halfway through. Henry clapped before he was supposed to. I sat there, hands folded, heart wide open. He didn't talk about the money, or the sickness, or even the silence from our past. He talked about strength, about love, about showing up. And I realized that's the only legacy I ever wanted. I don't know if they'll ever call again. Maybe they'll grow older, sicker, more desperate. Maybe Brent will burn every bridge he still has left. And maybe one day they'll need me again. I don't know what I'll do if that day comes, but I do know this: I will never again pour from a cup that left me empty. And I will never again return to places that asked me to shrink just to stay welcome. If you're standing where I once stood, at the crossroads between peace and pain, between duty and dignity, this is your sign. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. You are not broken for needing distance. You are not less loving because you walked away. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to rebuild. You are allowed to begin again, and sometimes beginning again is the bravest thing we'll ever do. If you've ever made the quiet choice to walk to stay strong, to start over, share your story below. Someone out there needs to hear it. You are not alone. Subscribe to Ian Reddit Story for more true stories of quiet justice, healing, and empowerment after 40, because every story is a second chance.